The 4th of July barbecue had 30 people crammed into my parents' backyard, string lights zigzagging between the oak trees my father had planted the same year I was born, my aunt's potato salad sweating on the folding table beside a cooler of beer nobody had bothered to keep in the shade. I hadn't even had time to change, hadn't had time to do anything except drive straight from Meridian Regional's quarterly finance review to my parents' house, still wearing the charcoal blazer I'd put on that morning for a room full of board members, because missing this barbecue wasn't an option my mother would forgive. Not after the year I'd already missed Easter for a budget crisis and Thanksgiving for the cardiac wing opening. I'd arrived late, my badge still clipped to my belt because I hadn't thought to unclip it, my laptop bag still in the trunk of my car because some habits from a 14-hour workday don't shed themselves easily just because you've crossed into your parents' driveway. My mother had hugged me at the door with a particular brightness she reserved for company, already steering me toward the backyard before I'd even set down my purse, already introducing me to my father's old college roommate, a man named Gary who I was fairly certain I'd met at least 4 times before, as our Danielle. She works at the hospital in town. I was refilling my water near the drink cooler when I noticed a small puddle forming near the patio door, condensation dripping steadily off a cooler someone had dragged too close to the threshold, pooling on the concrete in a way that would absolutely become a hazard once the sun went down and people stopped watching where they stepped. I mentioned it to my mother, mostly just making conversation the way you do at these things, gesturing toward the small puddle while balancing a paper plate of chips in my other hand, and before I'd finished the sentence, she'd already turned toward the crowd with the particular energy of someone who'd found a small crisis to manage in front of an audience. "Everyone, quiet down for a second," she called out, clapping her hands the way she used to when I was a kid and she wanted the classroom, or the carpool line, or whatever assembled group of children she happened to be herding, to pay attention. 17 relatives turned toward us at various speeds, aunts mid-conversation, uncles setting down their beers, cousins glancing up from their phones, my grandmother shifting slightly in her lawn chair to get a better view, my father's old college roommate Gary pausing with a hot dog halfway to his mouth. "Danielle's going to go grab the mop real quick, aren't you, sweetheart? Before somebody slips, and we've got a real problem on our hands." I blinked at her, genuinely confused for a half second, the way you are when a conversation takes a turn you didn't see coming. "Mom, I can just wipe it with a towel, it's not." No, we don't want a lawsuit on our hands." She laughed, the kind of laugh designed for an audience rather than for actual humor, bright and performative, and reached into her purse, the same quilted purse she'd carried to every family gathering for the past decade, pulling out a crumpled $50 bill, holding it up between 2 fingers like she was presenting a prize on a game show.
"Here.
For your trouble. Go on, it's fine. Everyone will wait. Won't you, everyone?" A few uncertain murmurs of assent rippled through the yard, the kind of noise people make when they're not sure what's happening but sense they're supposed to go along with it. The yard went quiet in that particular way that happens when 30 people simultaneously decide not to acknowledge how uncomfortable something is, the kind of silence that isn't really silence at all but a held breath, string lights swaying gently overhead as if even they were waiting to see what I'd do. My cousin Jake, 23 and always quick with a joke to defuse tension, let out an awkward laugh that died fast when nobody joined him. My grandmother frowned, genuinely confused now, unsure what exactly she'd just watched unfold in front of her. And I stood there in my work blazer, my badge still clipped to my belt from the hospital I'd left an hour and a half ago, my grandmother's homemade lemonade sweating in a cup in my hand, staring at a crumpled $50 bill my mother was holding out like she'd just tipped a valet at a restaurant, not asked her daughter to fetch cleaning supplies in front of the entire extended family. I thought, in that strange suspended second, about every version of this moment that had come before it. The Thanksgiving 3 years ago when my mother had asked me to run and get more folding chairs from the garage. "You're younger than your uncles," while I was in the middle of explaining a policy change to my father. The Christmas after that, when she'd introduced me to a new neighbor as our Danielle. She does something with paperwork at the hospital, while my brother-in-law, an insurance adjuster, got a full 3-minute introduction covering his recent promotion. The birthday party 2 summers back where she'd asked me to help serve cake to the children's table since you're good with that kind of thing. as though 6 years of graduate school and a hospital administration career had somehow qualified me primarily for cake distribution. I'd let all of it go, every single time, because making a scene at a family gathering felt like handing my mother exactly the kind of story she loved to tell afterward. Danielle got so worked up over nothing. You know how she is when she's stressed from work, a narrative that would somehow make me the unreasonable one no matter how reasonable my objection actually was. I'm not going to go get the mop, Mom. I kept my voice level, quiet enough that it wasn't yet a scene, but firm enough that anyone listening closely would hear the shift in it. Danielle, don't make this a thing, she said, her smile tightening at the edges, still performing for the yard even as her eyes flashed the particular warning I remembered from childhood dinner tables, the look that used to mean we'll discuss this later, not here. It's just a little water. Take the money and go grab it. It's in the garage where it's always been, right next to the rakes. I looked around at the faces watching us, some amused, some visibly uncomfortable, and looking for somewhere else to direct their attention, a few already reaching for their phones the way people do when they sense something worth remembering is unfolding in front of them, though whether out of genuine documentation instinct or simple reflex, I couldn't say. I thought about the fact that not one person in that yard, including my own parents, seemed to fully register what I actually did for a living, seemed to have absorbed anything beyond the vague, dismissive phrase my mother used at every family gathering. Danielle works at the hospital. Not runs. Not overseas. Not as responsible for 400 beds and a staff of 3,000 people. Just works like I was still the 16-year-old candy striper I'd once been, pushing a cart of magazines and get-well cards down a hallway for volunteer hours that looked good on a college application. Mom, I said quietly, though not so quietly that the yard couldn't hear it, my voice carrying just enough in the sudden hush that even Gary set down his hot dog entirely. I'm the chief operating officer of Meridian Regional. I don't mop floors. I haven't mopped a floor since I was 19 years old, working nights to pay for the classes that eventually got me this job. Her smile flickered, faltering for just a second before she recovered it, waving the crumpled bill slightly in the humid evening air like the fact of my job title was somehow beside the point, a technicality that didn't change the practical reality of a wet patio floor. Well, someone still has to do it, and you're standing right there, and you know where the garage is better than half these people. I felt something settle in me then, something quiet and clear and entirely unlike the flush of embarrassment I might have expected. Not anger, exactly. Something steadier than that. You're right, I said, my voice even, almost pleasant. Someone does need to handle it. I'll call facilities. I pulled out my phone, right there in front of 17 relatives, and scrolled to my facilities director's direct line, feeling the weight of 30 pairs of eyes on me as I did it, though I kept my expression as neutral as I would in any ordinary business call. My mother's hand, still holding out the crumpled $50 bill, hovered in the air for a moment before she seemed to realize the gesture no longer had anywhere useful to land. Marcus, hey, sorry to bother you on a holiday. My voice came out even, pleasant, the exact register I used walking into board meetings, completely unbothered by the fact that the entire backyard had gone silent enough to hear the crickets starting up in the tree line. Quick personal favor. Could you send someone by my parents' address to handle a spill? I'll text you the address now. No rush, whenever's convenient this evening, but I want it documented that I asked, just for my own records. Marcus, God bless him, 3 years into working under me, and well past the point of questioning my occasional oddities, didn't ask why the chief operating officer of the hospital system he worked for needed a mopping crew dispatched to a residential backyard barbecue on the 4th of July. He just said, "Sure thing, Danielle, I'll have someone swing by within the hour. I've got a guy finishing up a shift nearby," because in 3 years he'd learned that when I asked for something oddly specific, there was usually a reason worth not questioning, and because I'd never once asked him for a personal favor before, which probably told him something on its own. I hung up and slid my phone back into my blazer pocket, and the yard had gone fully silent now, the kind of silence that has texture to it, my mother still holding the $50 bill in an outstretched hand that had started, almost imperceptibly, to tremble. Somewhere near the grill, my father's spatula had gone still against the burgers, forgotten mid-flip. "You didn't have to do that," my mother said, her voice lower now, stripped entirely of its earlier performance, pitched just for me though the whole yard could still hear it in the quiet. No, I agreed. But you didn't have to hand me $50 in front of everyone and ask me to mop a floor either. So, I guess we're both doing things today we didn't strictly have to do. My father, who'd been quiet through all of it, cleared his throat from his spot by the grill, setting the spatula down properly this time. Danielle, your mother's just trying to keep things running smoothly, that's all this is. No need to call in the professionals over a little water. I run a 400-bed hospital, Dad. I kept my voice level, though something in my chest had gone tight and hot, a pressure that had been building for years finally finding a place to release. I manage a 9-figure operating budget. Last month, I oversaw the opening of an entire new cardiac wing, testified in front of the county health board, and fired a department head who'd been falsifying safety inspection reports. And every single family event, for 6 years now, you two introduce me like I'm still fetching supplies for a nursing station. I let it go every time, because I didn't want to make a scene at Christmas, at Easter, at Jake's graduation party. I'm done letting it go. My Aunt Carol, ever the peacemaker, the one who'd smoothed over every family disagreement since I was old enough to remember family disagreements happening, tried to laugh it off from her spot near the folding table. Oh, come on, it was just a joke, Danielle. Nobody meant anything by it. Your mother's just being your mother. You know how she gets. I know nobody meant anything by it, I said, and that was almost the worst part. The fact that this wasn't malice, wasn't cruelty, just decades of unexamined habit. The family shorthand that had calcified around me since I was the youngest, since I'd always been the baby, even at 34, since my accomplishments had simply never registered as adult enough to update the narrative everyone had quietly agreed to keep telling about me. That's exactly the problem, Aunt Carol. Nobody meant anything by it, and that's precisely why it's happened at every single gathering for 6 years without anyone ever stopping to think about it. My grandmother, who'd been quiet through all of this, shifted in her lawn chair, her voice carrying the particular clarity that sometimes came through even as her memory grew less reliable in other ways. Margaret, she said to my mother, using her full first name in the way she only did when she was genuinely displeased. What exactly is it you think Danielle does at that hospital? My mother opened her mouth, then closed it, some flicker of uncertainty crossing her face, as though the question itself had exposed something she hadn't examined closely enough to answer. She's in administration, my mother finally said, though it came out smaller than her usual pronouncements, less certain of its own footing. She handles the business side of things. She runs it, my grandmother said flatly. Doesn't she? The whole hospital. Didn't you tell me that yourself 2 years ago, when she got the promotion?
Chief something.
I remember because I told my bridge club, and Doris's granddaughter works there as a nurse and confirmed it, said everybody calls her Ms. Whitfield and stands up a little straighter when she walks through. The yard had gone quiet in a different way now, the earlier discomfort shifting into something closer to genuine reckoning, 30 people slowly recalibrating a narrative they'd apparently all absorbed without ever fully questioning it. I know what she does, my mother said, some sharpness returning to her voice now, though it sounded thinner than before, less certain of its audience. I'm proud of her. Everyone knows I'm proud of her. Then why, my grandmother said, still using that same flat, unhurried clarity, did you just hand her $50 to mop a floor in front of the whole family, like she's 16 years old again? I hadn't expected my grandmother, of all people, to be the one to say it out loud, to name the exact shape of what had been bothering me for years without me ever quite articulating it myself. Something in my chest loosened slightly, some tension I hadn't realized I was carrying easing just a fraction. My mother didn't answer right away, and in the silence that followed, I watched something shift across her face, not quite embarrassment, not quite understanding, but something adjacent to both, the particular expression of someone confronting a habit they'd never examined closely enough to recognize as a habit at all. I don't know, she finally said, quietly, and it was the most honest thing I'd heard her say all evening. I suppose I still think of her as... She stopped herself, glancing at me, something almost apologetic flickering across her features before the old performative brightness tried to reassert itself. unsuccessfully this time. I suppose old habits are hard to break. They are, I agreed. But I think it's time we both worked on breaking this particular one. The yard remained tense, but no longer entirely silent. Low murmurs picking back up around the edges as people processed what they'd just witnessed. My cousin Jake glancing between me and my mother with the particular caution of someone recalculating exactly how much he understood about a family he'd assumed he knew well. Gary, my father's old college roommate, had quietly resumed eating his hot dog, though he kept glancing toward me now with an expression that suggested he was mentally revising every previous conversation he'd ever had with me at these gatherings, searching for moments he might have unknowingly diminished me the same way. I stood there for a moment longer, my water cup sweating in my hand, waiting to see if my mother would say anything further, if this would resolve into an actual conversation or simply dissolve back into uncomfortable silence the way family confrontations so often did, papered over until the next gathering when everyone pretended it had never happened at all. Instead, in the distance, I heard the low hum of an approaching engine, and a moment later, a white van with the Meridian Regional Facilities Management logo stenciled on its side turned carefully into my parents' driveway, exactly as I'd asked, exactly on schedule, a small, undeniable piece of evidence that the version of myself standing in that backyard wasn't the 16-year-old candy striper my mother still seemed to be picturing, but someone with an entire hospital system's operations. Quietly at her command, even on a holiday, even in a driveway 3 miles from where she'd grown up. The van door slid open, and Marcus himself climbed out, not one of his junior staff, but the actual facilities director, a broad-shouldered man in his 50s who'd worked at Meridian Regional longer than I had, wearing a polo with the hospital's logo embroidered discreetly on the chest, and carrying a mop and a small bucket like it was the most ordinary errand in the world. He'd clearly changed out of whatever he'd been wearing for his own holiday plans, and I felt a small pang of guilt at having pulled him away from his own family barbecue, a guilt I made a mental note to address properly on Monday, with something more substantial than a thank you email. "Evening, everyone," Marcus said cheerfully to the yard at large, apparently unbothered by the fact that 30 relatives were staring at him with varying degrees of confusion, as though a hospital facilities director materializing at a family cookout was simply an unusual, but ultimately unremarkable Tuesday. He walked past the drink cooler, spotted the puddle immediately, and got to work with the brisk efficiency of a man who mopped floors in emergency rooms and surgical wings for a living, someone for whom a small patio spill barely registered as a task at all. "Anything else, Ms. Whitfield?" he asked, using my last name the way he did at the hospital, in front of board members, in front of anyone who needed to understand exactly what my title meant, the honorific landing in that quiet backyard with a weight it had never carried in any conference room. "No, that's everything, Marcus. Thank you for coming out on the holiday. I'll make sure it's noted, and I owe you one. Seriously, tell your wife I'm sorry for pulling you away." He waved it off good-naturedly, packed up his bucket, and left as quickly as he'd arrived, the van pulling out of the driveway and disappearing down the street while the yard remained quiet in its wake, string lights swaying slightly in the evening breeze that had picked up as the sun dropped lower behind the oak trees. My grandmother, who'd watched the entire exchange with the sharp, unblinking attention of someone finally seeing something she'd suspected for a while confirmed in front of her, looked at my mother with an expression I hadn't seen her wear in years, something between disappointment and a kind of dawning, uncomfortable recognition. The look of a woman realizing she'd let something go on far longer than she should have simply because family gatherings weren't the place for confrontations. My mother finally lowered the $50 bill, which she'd been holding, forgotten, this entire time, tucking it back into her purse with hands that weren't quite steady. "I think I owe you an apology," she said, quiet enough now that only the closest relatives could hear, though the yard had grown attentive enough that I suspected everyone caught it anyway. "You do," I said. "But not just for tonight. For 6 years of this. I'd like it to actually mean something this time, not just smooth over an awkward moment in front of company, and then quietly go back to normal by Labor Day." She nodded slowly, and something in her face suggested she finally understood the difference, the distinction between an apology offered for an audience and one that actually required her to change something afterward. Across the yard, my cousin Jake, the one who'd laughed nervously earlier and then gone quiet as the whole thing unfolded, raised his glass slightly in my direction, a small, silent acknowledgement that landed more meaningfully than anything else said that evening, a gesture that felt less like taking sides and more like simply, finally, seeing me clearly. The barbecue didn't end there, though the energy of it shifted noticeably for the rest of the evening. People drifted back into smaller conversations, the way crowds do after a tense moment passes, though I noticed several relatives approaching me over the next hour with a kind of newly curious attention I hadn't experienced at a family gathering in years. My Uncle Pete, who I don't think had asked me a single substantive question about my work in over a decade, cornered me by the dessert table wanting to know how exactly a hospital's operating budget worked, whether I actually had authority over hiring decisions, whether it was true that I'd been the one to open the cardiac wing my mother had apparently mentioned once, in passing, at some point, though clearly not with enough emphasis for it to register properly. "Your mom mentioned the cardiac wing thing a while back," Pete said, scooping a slice of pie onto his plate, "but I guess I always figured that was, I don't know, a committee thing. Didn't realize you were the one actually running point on it." "I was," I said. 18 months of planning, a dozen contractor negotiations, and testifying in front of the county health board twice. It opened in March. "Huh," Pete said, and I watched him actually recalibrate something behind his eyes, the way you do when a piece of information you'd filed away as minor suddenly demands to be filed somewhere more significant. "That's actually really impressive, Danielle. I had no idea." "Most people don't," I said, and I meant it without bitterness, just as a simple statement of fact, though the fact itself had clearly needed 30 people and a mop bucket to finally register. My father found me near the end of the evening, once most of the relatives had started gathering their folding chairs and empty casserole dishes, the fireworks display down at the community park still an hour off. He looked older in the fading light than I usually let myself notice, the strain of the evening visible in the set of his shoulders. "I owe you an apology, too," he said, quieter than I was used to hearing from him. "I've let your mother run point on how we talk about you at these things for years, mostly because it was easier than pushing back, and I think somewhere along the way I stopped paying attention to whether what she was saying actually matched who you'd become. That's on me as much as her." "Thank you for saying that," I said, and I meant it, though some old, tired part of me wished it hadn't taken a facilities van pulling into the driveway for either of them to say it at all. "Your grandmother's right, you know," he added, glancing over to where she sat, now deep in conversation with my Aunt Carol, gesturing animatedly about something. "We should be telling people what you actually do. Not because it makes us look good at parties, but because you worked damn hard to get there, and pretending otherwise does you a disservice. And honestly," he added, a small, rueful smile crossing his face, "it probably does us a disservice too. People probably think we don't pay attention to our own kid's life." I laughed at that, something in my chest finally loosening all the way, the tightness I'd carried since my mother first held up that crumpled $50 bill dissolving into something more like exhaustion, the ordinary kind that comes after a long day rather than the corrosive kind that builds over years of small dismissals. My mother approached as the last of the daylight gave way to dusk, the string lights finally earning their keep against the darkening sky, holding 2 glasses of the lemonade my grandmother always made from scratch. She handed me one without a word, and we stood together near the drink cooler, the same cooler, I noted, that had started this entire evening, in a silence that felt different from the silence earlier, less charged, more like 2 people genuinely trying to figure out where to go from here. "I've been thinking about what you said," she began, turning her glass slowly in her hands. "About it happening for 6 years. I went back through it in my head while Marcus was mopping, if you can believe that, standing right there wondering what exactly I'd been doing all this time." She paused. "I think I got stuck somewhere. In my head you're still 19, working nights, calling me stressed about tuition. I never quite updated the picture, even as you kept becoming someone entirely different in front of me." "I'm not asking you to forget who I used to be," I said. "I'm asking you to actually see who I am now. There's room for both, Mom. I just need the second part to exist somewhere in how you talk about me." "I can do that," she said, and for the first time all evening, it didn't sound like a line delivered for an audience. It sounded like an actual promise, however uncertain, made by someone who'd been genuinely startled into examining something she'd never thought to examine before. We didn't fully resolve it that night, not in the tidy, complete way that makes for a satisfying ending. My mother introduced me differently at Labor Day, 2 months later, to a neighbor I hadn't met before. "This is my daughter Danielle. She's the chief operating officer over at Meridian Regional," and stumbled slightly over the unfamiliar formality of the title in her mouth, like new shoes she hadn't broken in yet, but she said it clearly and audibly, and I felt something settle in my chest that had been unsettled for 6 years. The $50 bill, I later learned from my grandmother, who told me with evident satisfaction the following week over the phone, never got spent that night. My mother had tucked it into a kitchen drawer when she got home, and my grandmother had found it there weeks later while looking for a rubber band, still crumpled, an artifact of an evening that had apparently needed marking somehow, even if unintentionally. I stayed until the fireworks that night, watching them bloom over the trees from a lawn chair beside my grandmother, who patted my hand once, wordlessly, in the way she'd done since I was small whenever she wanted to communicate something too large for the moment to hold properly. I drove home once the display ended and the crowd had thinned to just immediate family folding chairs and gathering coolers, my blazer still slightly damp from the humidity, my badge still clipped to my belt, thinking that some fights aren't really about the $50 or the mop, or even the puddle by the patio door. Some fights are about finally refusing to shrink yourself down to a size your family finds comfortable, even after you've spent years building something they still can't quite bring themselves to see clearly, even when the people who raised you need an actual van, an actual mop, and an actual moment of public reckoning to finally, fully update the picture they'd been carrying of you since you were 19 years old and still figuring out who you'd become.